Okay, here is part 2 of the lecture, Globalization of Education, and this is what you'll take up again in the first portion of the class. So as a recap, just make sure you understand this idea of globalization of ed that essentially says that what you experience locally is really going to be impacted by what's going on globally and vice versa, right? That these are both mutually influencing one another. So now we're going to sort of tease this out just a little bit more and talk about some of these global educational discourses and how this plays out. And this is you'll find that the way that I do the lessons, I might come to some of the stuff in the readings, but I'm not going to recreate everything that's in the readings. So it's going to be essential to be successful in the class. It's going to be essential that you look at the lessons, but also make sure you do the reading in depth. Spring is pretty hard, so you're going to have to give yourself enough time. I understand that he's challenging, but I think he still does a really great job of outlining how these global processes work. And so I'll do my best to elaborate some of this throughout the lessons, but also you're going to need to try and do the best you can with the readings as well. And that would be the place too, if you have any questions about anything, maybe go into the question and answer portion under Blackboard, because if you have a question about something, probably somebody else does too. Okay. So there's some different understandings of globalization. Just in its most basic sense, globalization is going to be that social phenomenon that's really been going on over the past 40 years that's characterized by temporal and spatial compression. So temporal compression is really the instantaneous flow of ideas and information. Thinking about how global media and social media plays out, the fact that you don't have to wait to communicate with somebody in another country. I'm guessing probably a lot of you all have been to other countries. I'm guessing you have friends in other countries that you connect with on Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media that you use. In addition to that, we know simultaneously what's going on in the world, and we have access to that information, and that's really been facilitated by advancements in technology. So it's become a situation now where, the time that separates us, the time that it takes to communicate across the globe is not the same as it used to be a long time ago, right? That it's instantaneous at this point. And that impacts, too, this idea of spatial compression, which is the compression of the actual space that separates us, and the fact that the world is becoming more and more interconnected, and that human populations across the globe are being formed into these complex social relations, that, we have those communications, and what happens in other countries really does have an impact on what we experience nationally. And this is conscious and it's unconscious. So in your textbook, Spring's going to talk about some of the ways that spatial compression happens. And this is him going into a lot of those dashscapes, the ideas of apoduri, which is really looking at these global networks that have been enabled by these advances in information technology, mass media, global institutions, social media, all these different forms of media, and how those have created these global networks that essentially put all of us in connection with everyone else across the globe. And that's created, this situation where you have these global flows of ideas, practices, institutions, artifacts, and people, right? It's not just, social media. We're actually traveling to different countries. You have people that, we live in a multicultural workforce where you can actually do business in other nations. And you don't necessarily have to be in those other nations to be doing business with them. And so that's part of these ideascapes, these mediascapes, financescapes that Spring talks about when he looks at these global flows and these global networks. And this is really looking at this geographical conception of global movement that's built on this vision of dynamic change, innovation, and technological development, right? And related to this too, one of these major ideas here is the global economy, right? That we live in a global economy. That I remember a few years ago, the markets in China crashed, and that really messed with us. And the same thing, obviously, when the bubble burst in 2008. That impacted what everybody else experienced in other countries as well. So when we're talking about the global economy, we're really talking about the emergence of global markets and supply chains that are going to link individual national economies into an international division of labor, right? When you think about the division of labor, I guess in a lot of ways you can think of it maybe in terms of like a class system sort of, but if you expand that to the global economy, you can see this as well. And this is really, again, facilitated by these advances in information technology. So if you look at how this plays out, how this division of labor plays out, you've got your high technology nations. And these are going to be the nations that have those high value production, right? That function mostly in services and, in sort of the buying and selling of money and service, and it's not just about the production of industrial products or resource extraction. And so those high technology nations are going to be those developed Western nations. The second would be like your industrial nations that are going to produce items of lower value, right? So these would be maybe your actual products as opposed to just these services that our economy as a developed nation is really based on. And that's going to be more your developing nations. And then your most underdeveloped nations, the processes here are really going to be sort of resource extraction, right? The lowest value production. And this would be like the kinds of resources that you have in a nation. You're essentially taking those instead of like building materials, instead of building cars and selling those, or creating like this service sector, right, where you're buying and selling these services. Here you're actually taking the national resources, and those are going to be what you're exporting to other places. So it ends up being resource extraction here, and this has created this sort of global division of labor. And this is really the idea of the global economy is really the dominant perspective in popular discourse, right? That we're participating in a global world, and it's not just about a national economy anymore, as it was maybe in the 50s and 60s and that sort of thing. Okay. And so one of the major ideas that's going to play into this global economy concept is going to be the knowledge economy. And Spring's going to talk more about this in chapter 2, but this is going to be one of those most central ideas that we're going to keep coming back to in the course. So make sure you understand this. This will for sure be on the first examination as well. So the knowledge economy is really thinking about this idea that knowledge is the most important factor in economic development. And again, that's very much associated with the global economy. As evidence, this is very much a perspective that you'll see here in the U.S. When you think about why do students go to school? If your experiences were to go to college, to get a good job, that's part of this knowledge economy idea, right? That we go to school so that we can eventually be economically viable, as opposed to, say, an empowered democratic citizenry. And Arne Duncan was our former Secretary of Education. He just I don't guess he retired. He just left office within the last 6 months, I'd say. And one of his sort of catchphrases that he keeps saying, if you look at any speech by him, he talks constantly about this idea that we have to educate our way to a better economy. And that's one of those hallmark ideas of a knowledge economy. And you'll hear Arne Duncan talk about that as well as our new Secretary of Education too. So there's 4 major ideas that are associated with the knowledge economy. These are going to be related to some of the stuff that Spring's going to talk about in chapter 1. But like I said before, these are also just some major ideas to try and elaborate what Spring talks about in these chapters as well. So One of the main ideas behind the knowledge economy is this concept of human capital. And that's this conception that education and the training of a population is an economic input. So, the more educated a population is, the greater the prosperity, not only of the individual, but of the nation itself. So, we go to school in order to advance our income potential, right? Go to college so that you can get a good job, so that you can be economically viable. So, then education becomes an economic input, right? And that's this understanding of human capital. You're also going to see people talking about lifelong learning. There are different conceptions, as you'll see, of what lifelong learning is really going to entail. In terms of a knowledge economy, lifelong learning is really looking at the idea that rapid changes in the global economy are going to require us to constantly retool our skill sets throughout our lives. It used to be in the past that, you go to school, maybe even just get a high school diploma, and, if you're really advanced, you'll go and get a college degree, and then you're going to get a job, and you're going to stay at the same company for your whole career and retire from that company. The new reality is that there's this continuous creation and destruction of entire industries. So, the kind of stuff that we're trained for now might not necessarily even exist 5 years from now. So the new formula is really that individuals have to constantly retrain to meet the demands of a new economic reality. We have to be more and more competitive. And I'm guessing a lot of you guys have experienced this too. I know I have. That, it's not just that you can go and get a college degree anymore. For many of us, getting an advanced degree is really going to set us apart from the other job seekers that are out there. So it's become a situation even where it's not just even a college degree that's going to make you competitive anymore. And so you're having to constantly go and acquire new expertise so that you can be competitive in that job market. The third major idea behind the knowledge economy is economic development. And that, is really saying that education is an economic investment, not just for individuals, but for nations too. So if you're an advanced economy, like most developed Western nations, the idea behind investing in a knowledge economy is that you want to maintain advantages through education investments. So you want to create new economies so that you can create new industries and new services so that you can constantly remain economically viable. When you hear in schools this need to innovate, right? When you hear in the workforce that you have to be innovative, you have to be creative thinkers and thinking outside the box. This is very much part of this idea of the knowledge economy, that we want to create students or create workers who can innovate and come up with new products, right? Because everything is always changing. If you're a developing economy, the knowledge economy is going to be that path to economic development and growth. And so this is going to be a way to get competitive with other advanced economies and move up that value chain, right? Move up positions in that international division of labor. So you will see these developing nations starting to invest in education as a means to potentially get more competitive with other advanced economies. And so the fourth major idea is multiculturalism, the fact that we live in a multicultural society, and so the knowledge economy is a way to provide cultural learning for global societies. The fact that there's global migration and that we have these multicultural workforces and consumers, so students need to be able to work within those multicultural worlds, and the fact that we're actually doing business in different nations. So you have to be able to function in that sort of multicultural world as well. And so these are some of the major ideas. And again, Spring is going to pick back up on this too in chapter 2. But this is just a general introduction to what the knowledge economy is and some of the major components of how it plays out. Spring provides us with a few world models of education, and these are going to be related to these ideas behind a knowledge economy. He provides the economic world model, the progressive world model, the religious world model, as well as the indigenous world model. The two biggies that you'll see play out in most national education systems are going to be the economic world model and the progressive world model. And we're going to keep coming back to these throughout the whole semester. So make sure you have a pretty good understanding of this, and revisit spring if you have any questions, or let me know if you have any questions about this too. But these are going to be impacting these two competing discourses about the goals and purposes of schooling. And that's one hallmark of your essay question that's going to be on your first examination. And this is something I'd like you to think about in that first discussion board as well. So the economic world model is really, this is going to be your dominant perspective in these global education discourses. This is this idea that you want to embrace the concept of the knowledge economy. So the goals and purposes of schooling become primarily economic, right? You input knowledge, i.e. education, and you output economic productivity, right? So once you get done with college, you can get a good job and be economically competitive. And so it's this very much narrow understanding of education as a sort of inputs and outputs, sort of contributing to that global economy through education. Your progressive education world model is still going to embrace economic development, right? You still want to make sure that our students are economically viable, but that's not the primary goal behind school, right? That's not why we go to school. The goal is not just to get a job. The goal becomes here to prepare a democratic citizenry, to contribute to a more socially just society, a sustainable society, to preserve specific cultures and facilitate peace here. So you're still going to have economic development. It's just the way that you go about it might look a little bit different. And you'll find that when we start looking in those national systems, that you'll see both of these play out. The economic model is probably the most prevalent, but you will see the other as well as we go through. So think about that. Thinking about your own history and what sorts of practices you might have experienced related to these, and how that worked out for you as well. So be sure to pick up on that as you explore that in your first discussion board. So there's a major duality between the globalization of education. As I mentioned before, you've got, these global institutions and corporations and organizations that are going to impact what you experience in the classroom and vice versa. And so you'll see, some of the ways that this plays out is through the relationship between this superstructure and local concerns, and how sometimes those might be at odds with one another. So for the first part of the course, we're going to be looking at some of these global institutions, and the ones that we're going to focus on are UNESCO, which is a subset of the United Nations. That stands for the United Nations Education and I don't even remember right now, so I'll have to look that up. But you can look that up too, and we'll go through it. But that's UNESCO, the OECD, which stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Bank. And so these are some of these major global institutions, and we'll look at how those impact the globalization of education as we move through that first part of the semester. You're also going to think about these transnational corporations, Pearson, your Apollo Group, these different business organizations and think tanks, as well as these global universities, and how those impact the globalization of education as well. And those will pick up probably more in Chapter 4 when we start looking at edubusiness. Most of these global institutions are going to adopt the perspective of education as an economic input, but not all of them. So the UN sees education as the key to democracy, cultural preservation, and peace. And so it's going to represent a distinction between how these practices play out. So again, we'll be looking at that superstructure and how that interacts with some of these local concerns, right? So it's not just these global institutions that dictate what happens, but it's also the local that are going to impact global stuff as well. And so some of these local concerns that you're going to see sometimes being at odds with these global institutions are going to be thinking about politics and how do you facilitate political cohesion when you have all of these global ideas going on. What about cultural values? If you say everything's about economic development, what if that's at odds with a particular country or a particular community's cultural values, as well as the language that they might speak and the religion that they might practice as well? So that's something that we'll keep coming back to throughout the semester. So just as a recap, again, stuff that I repeat here is probably going to be pretty important, so make sure that you have a good understanding of how this plays out. So the globalization is really going to refer to the worldwide discussions, processes, and institutions affecting local educational practices and policies. And it's going to treat individual nations as being in dynamic relations with global ed processes and discourses. So essentially, what happens globally impacts the local and vice versa. And that's going to be the end of part 1. Next time we'll look more specifically at the World Bank and explore some of the intricacies of the knowledge economy a little bit more and how that's played out. And then we'll start looking at some of those other global superstructures. So, thanks.